Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Think Before You Hate podcast, the official podcast for the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. And in this podcast, we will discuss all of the latest topics on civil rights here in the city of Chicago. I'm Alex, the public relations representative for the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. We work diligently to eliminate prejudice and fight discrimination in Chicago. We enforce the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance as well as the Fair Housing Ordinance. Today, we have a great pleasure of speaking with CCHR's Deputy Commissioner, Joanne Newsom, who will educate us on discrimination on criminal records, specifically in employment. Joanne, thank you for being here today and connecting with us on our podcast. Can you please tell the audience and myself and everyone else, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you go to school? Where'd you grow up? Who is Joanne Newsom?
Thank you for having me, Alex. My name is Joanne Newsom, Deputy Commissioner at the Commission on Human Relations. I've worked for the Commission just over 26 years. I was born and raised in Chicago. Mm-hmm. I went to college in upstate New York, a tiny college, liberal arts college called Eisenhower College. It closed, and I finished my university studies at University of Illinois at Chicago. I then went to law school at DePaul University College of Law.
Oh, beautiful. Now, what inspired you to go to law school and pursue a career in civil rights law specifically?
Well, what inspired me to go to law school? In high school, my history teacher encouraged a number of us students to pursue law. At the time, it just kind of was in the back of my mind. I didn't think about it until after I graduated from college, and I realized I've always kind of wanted to go to law school. And so I went. Now, by that time, I was in my early 30s and had a son, so I was considered a non-traditional student, but I made it through. Civil rights specifically, I've always had an interest in housing discrimination in particular, but just justice in general, I've always had an interest.
One question that I just had in my mind, like why this specific set of law, and because there's different types of avenues you can go into, especially in civil rights law and what have you.
Well, I will say civil rights, nowadays people, when I say I work in civil rights, they look at the civil rights, they think of the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
They think of way back then. They don't think that they think discrimination is over. They don't think we have the same issues. And while we might not have specifically the same issues, we do. They're just that have a different name. They look different than before.
Sure. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And of course, criminal background law, or I don't know what the exact terminology would be, but.
Well, this is a whole new law for a whole new area for the commission. So I can't say, that I thought about criminal history discrimination before, because honestly, politically speaking, it's not an area that people feel a lot of compulsion to support or to protect. However, when people are released from prison or custody, or if they have a criminal record, you want them to be able to get employment.
Sure.
And so the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance has protected criminal history for several years, but initially it was ban the box, I believe starting in 2014. The ban the box provision was basically on an employment application. Many of us can remember that after you fill out all of your personal information, the very bottom of the first page, it would say, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And there was a little box you would check. If you checked that box, most employers wouldn't go any further. Yeah. So under the ban the box provision, you had to move that box further along in the application process, so that once an employer, prospective employer, decides to interview you, then they can check to see if you have a criminal history or ask you to check that box. Okay. But in 2023, I think just over the course of many years, there's been a push for restorative justice and the idea that people, once they pay their debt to society, they should be able to come back into society and get employment. We expanded the definition of criminal history protection to all phases of employment. So it's not just pre-employment, it's also once you get a job or while you're trying to get a job. They can't use your criminal history. There are many exceptions to it, but just in general, for the hiring, promotion, recruitment, all aspects of employment, you can't ask about a person's criminal history.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting to know. Now, will you please let us know about your work with returning residents in Chicago, and more importantly, what defines a returning resident? So how did you become an expert in this part of the law?
Oh, I wish I could say I was an expert. I'm not an expert because it's new.
Okay, yeah. All right.
I'm going to become an expert, put it
Right.
that way. So we'll start with your question about returning residents. So just the catch-all phrase is returning residents. We want to make sure returning residents are able to get employment. There's returning residents. The technical definition is people who are returning from incarceration, people who have been incarcerated and they're returning back into society. However, the criminal history protection under the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance protects people's criminal record as well. So if you've been arrested, you're not convicted, you haven't been incarcerated, but you have a criminal record, that also protects that. So there's returning residents, but there's also just people with criminal histories.
Okay. Makes sense. Now, can you let our listeners know how this ordinance is designed to help returning residents when looking for employment, or at least expand on that?
So a person, just in general, a person can file a complaint of discrimination if they feel they've been discriminated against in their employment. Well, let me just say this. I'll stop and say this, that the criminal history protection it only applies to employment. Okay. At this moment, it does not apply in the housing context or any other context. So if someone files a complaint of discrimination, and says, I was not able to get this job, they found I had a criminal history, they denied me this job or denied me a promotion on my job. The first thing, we'll file an actual complaint. We make sure that we have jurisdiction over the complaint. It happened in 365 days or less from the time they come to file the complaint. It happened within the city of Chicago. Once we determine that we have jurisdiction, we then investigate the complaint. We serve the complaint on the employer, and that's when we investigate whether or not there are exceptions to it. So one of the exceptions under the criminal history protection is that an exception to discrimination is that an employer can turn you down for employment if your conviction is substantially related to the job that you are going for. So the most common thing is if you robbed a bank and then you're looking for a job at a bank, they can turn you away for that reason.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the investigation would first get the information from the respondent or the employer. Why did you turn this person down, or why did you not give this individual a promotion? And we would evaluate that evidence, the evidence that the complainant brings forth, the person who's looking for the job, and the employer, the person who denied them the job. We assess and evaluate the evidence and determine whether or not there was discrimination based on criminal history.
Very well then. Now, in addition to the CCHR, are there any other resources in the city of Chicago that can help returning residents?
Yes, the Department of Family and Support Services, they have an entire department, an entire unit that handles returning residents. They're more direct services. We make sure that we protect you from discrimination. They help you with services, employment, housing, medical, health or medical services. There are lots of services the Department of Family and Support Services provides to returning residents. And they also have, I think there are 5 community resource centers around the city of Chicago that are in communities where residents live. They can go directly to receive services.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great to know, and hopefully this information, specifically about the other resources, can be useful to those listening right now. And lastly, I'm going to ask you this one question I have asked previous guests, and I'm going to continue to ask the same question for all guests and future episodes. In your opinion, what can our listeners do in their everyday lives to combat hate and discrimination?
Oh, wow, that's a tall order.
There's no wrong answer.
Okay.
This is just a question I always want to ask, because there's more than one way. And of course, you being the deputy commissioner of the CCHR, you have your own unique perspective. So what does Joanne suggest?
I would say we have to start with the realization that we have more in common. This is what people say. We have more in common than we don't have in common. And the idea that someone who's different from you is someone that you should hate or someone that you should discriminate against is all based in fear. It's all based in fear because you don't know that person. You can't identify with that person. And I think once we let go of the fear of someone just being different, then we can eliminate hate and discrimination.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. When I've asked our previous guests the same question, might be some elements of the same answer you delivered. But there are certain gems that might be considered cliche, if you will,
Yes.
because they are the truth. They're a fact. They're cliche for a reason. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Now,
I would agree.
You provided us a lot of insight about returning residents and how the CCHR, and specifically the Human Rights Ordinance, protects returning residents in employment when looking for work. Is there anything else that you would like to add that I haven't asked you today?
Well, it's not an answer to a question precisely, but I think where the Commission on Human Rights, because this is a new area of protection for us, criminal history, this expansion, we're looking for opportunities to speak with different communities. We want to provide information and education, not only to returning residents or people with criminal histories, but also to prospective employers, people in the community who might be nervous about hiring someone with a criminal history. We like to get out in front of people and just talk to people and talk about the ordinance, talk about the protections, talk about how you can get in trouble and not get in trouble in terms of violating the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance. So we look for opportunities to speak with different groups if that's possible.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And well, Joanne, thank you very much for your time today. And you provided a lot of great information about returning residents and how we protect them when they look for employment. So I know you said that you weren't an expert, but I think you're just being too modest. So thank you very much. Yes, thank you for joining on this podcast today, and really appreciate you speaking on this topic because this is a topic that, at least in my own personal opinion, isn't really talked about that much, especially in the realm of civil rights and human rights here in the city of Chicago. And even the term returning residents, for me, is I just hadn't heard of that term before until I started working with the CCHR myself. Do you happen to know how old that term returning resident is?
I don't know.
If you don't, that's fine. I'm just genuinely curious.
Well, I think, before people would refer to them as ex-cons. And that's really derogatory. That's taking away someone's humanity, first of all. Secondly, it has
a bad negative connotation when people hear ex-con.
Future. It's really, you're like, you're hanging someone's past around their neck instead of saying you're going forward. Where returning residents came, I don't know how long. It's been several years, I know, but I'm not really sure.
Okay.
But it's definitely better than saying ex-convict.
Yeah, sure.
Especially since not everyone with a criminal record was convicted of the offense. There are people with criminal histories, people who just have arrest records, but it stays on their record, but they were never convicted. But they walk around unable to find employment because of that stain, and they were never convicted of it.
So it's definitely very important to eliminate the stigma. Well, again, Joanne, thank you very much for your time in discussing criminal background discrimination with us. And I really appreciate your wisdom, and I learned a lot today. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today for our podcast, for this week's episode of the Think Before You Hate podcast.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes, of course, my pleasure. If you or anybody you know believes that they've been a victim of discrimination, please do not hesitate to contact the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. And you could always file a complaint online at chicago.gov/CCHR. Again, that is chicago.gov/CCHR. And please follow us on social media as well. We're on Facebook, we're on X, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, and newly we're also on Blue Sky. Please, if you ever feel like you've been a victim of discrimination, do not hesitate to contact us. And until next time, remember, think before you hate.